Now we are live. I think I better plug in my computer. That's what I think I should do.
And hi, everybody. If you are seeing us and hearing us, say hello in the chat so we can make sure this is working before we jump into a great topic today. We're happy to have you joining us. Robin's on the road. Hopefully I won't have a parade, but one of our lives, Robin was on the road, and I had a parade going by my house. The local high school, I found out later.
That was crazy. And I'm actually still on the road, but like we were literally driving in the RV, and I told Greg, I go, that is stressful. I do not want to be doing it while we're driving. So now we just didn't get to where we wanted to get to. But so this time we're at least parked. So.
And hopefully no protesters are coming by.
No, we're in the middle of nowhere, so nobody's coming by anywhere. Where we are trying to go to Facebook to see if we're on there.
Yeah, I haven't seen anybody say hello. But
oh yeah, we are online.
Okay, great.
That's always good. And there's at least 13 people watching, so if y'all can hear us, hopefully you can, just post something in the comment box and say hi or let us know you're there. Courtney does say howdy, so it could just be that our stream is not working, which sometimes happens with being live too. Because several people have said, Chrissy Joy is here with all the pups, including her newest, cutest puppy. Laura is here from New Orleans. Charlene Parker's here. So it's probably just a delay. We do definitely. Courtney says we hear you, so that's great too. Good. So do you want to start with introducing David, Susan?
Our guest, yes. For those of you who have not had the pleasure, we're very happy and excited to have David Pearsall from Business Insurers of the Carolinas with us today. And David is, I think, I met you serving on a panel together at APDT one year, David, and it was like, this is the greatest guy that can make insurance seem not so overwhelming and intimidating. And we just really appreciate how much you go out of your way to help, I guess, educate and help us understand something that seems kind of, we have to have it, but it can be overwhelming. So David, thank you for joining us and helping us answer some insurance questions, because the world's changed since we talked last.
Absolutely. Thank you, Susan. And thank you, Robin, for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to share. So fire away. We'll answer some questions.
Well, I think we'll get started, and then I'm going to be typing on and off because I just typed something in the comments and it didn't show up. So now I'm going to type on my iPhone at the same time instead of the platform we're using. Anyway, we'll adapt. But I think what we want to start with, David, is what are kind of the bare minimum things folks need to know in terms of reviewing their insurance policies, or if they don't have insurance, like what are the key things that you would say are important? Let's just start there, and then we'll veer off into things that have changed with today's world.
Okay, well, that's easy. First and foremost, I think everybody, if you're in business today, really needs a general liability policy that's going to cover bodily injury or property damage to others, to a third party. And then if you are caring for pets, you want to make sure you have animal bailey or care, custody, or control coverage to cover those animals and pets in your care, custody, or control. And that could also be if you're a trainer and training pets as well, because if they're in your class and they get injured. And typically that's an addendum or an endorsement to a general liability policy, or it could be covered separately under a property form, depending on type of, whether you have a business owner's policy. But it really comes down to what type of business you have. But liability is crucial for everybody. Even if you are, a hairdresser or a plumber, everybody needs liability coverage. And then I would follow that up by saying if you're worried about injuries on the job, so if someone were to get hurt, including yourself, even if you're one person, you would need workers' compensation insurance. And that's going to cover injuries and occupational diseases that occur. And so if you have employees, it's pretty much mandated in most states Sometimes it's one person. Some states like Florida, it may be a 4-person minimum, but most all states require you to carry it, except for Texas. I think they're the lone exception. So yeah, Texas is the lone star state.
Yeah.
So those two coverages are primary. Then you're going to look at auto liability and auto insurance, especially if you're doing pet transport, you're doing deliveries, if you're a retail store, or any of those types of things it's going to require you to use a vehicle. You're going to need auto liability insurance for that. And then even if you have other people driving their vehicles on behalf of your business, then you want to get non-owned auto coverage, which protects the business for them driving their personal vehicles on behalf of your business. So those are the 3 primary. And then when you have a facility, you're going to look for property insurance. So I know you asked what the bare minimum is, but all of these things really varies depending on your particular business.
And what are considerations based on trainers versus, taking into consideration everyone needs the basics, but then trainers or dog sitters or daycares or groomers, I know when I was a trainer, I had trainers insurance to cover my trainers. Is that considered part of the liability, or is that a separate clause, or for each of those different types of services, are there specific considerations?
Absolutely, and there is for sure. So, with trainers, you have liability exposure, a general liability exposure, but you also have professional liability exposure, or errors or omissions. So, especially if you're working with highly aggressive dogs, or if you are training service animals. Let's say we're training for someone who's hearing impaired or seeing impaired, and you train a service dog, and after the training is done, the person walks the blind person out in the street. Or after the training's done, we all know you have to train people as well as pets if you're a trainer. But let's say that the person doesn't work with their dog, and they now allege that it jumps on somebody, and they try to bring a suit. A lot of times these are frivolous lawsuits, but you can be sued. You still have to defend yourself, and that can get expensive. And if they can prove that there's negligence on your part, that you didn't train, certainly don't want to make guarantees. Right. Even if you can, you're the best trainer in the world, you still don't want to make guarantees, because that's going to put you in a position where your errors and omissions can really come into play, because you guaranteed that the dog would not jump again, and we know we can't do that. It just doesn't happen. But so that's a consideration for a trainer, is they need the errors and omissions, and they also need some coverage for the care, custody, or control, especially if they're doing training with the dogs in their care, if they're doing one-on-ones or doing board and trains. And then they may also need some boarding liability coverage to cover you while boarding for the pet. And then daycares, you have more of a property exposure, typically daycare and boarding facilities. And so you bring up a lot of other things, because typically trainers may be a one-person outfit, and may not need workers' comp, but a boarding daycare facility, most definitely, if they have employees, they're going to need a workers' comp policy. Then depending on how many employees they have, they may need employment practices liability insurance as well, which covers, harassment, discrimination, wrongful termination, failure to hire. And we're seeing more and more of these suits pop up across the country. And a lot of people, a lot of people don't even think about that coverage. They don't even know what that coverage is. They think, well, I've got workers' comp and employer's liability, but that's not the same thing as employment practices liability. And again, people can sue for anything. And there's people suing right now for being let go, over COVID. So they're suing their employers for wrongful termination. And so those things, we're going to see more of those suits. We're likely to see a lot more suits. It's going to be interesting to watch over the next 6 to 12 months. But yeah, so again, those are things. And then if you have like a pet sitter or a dog walker, they're going to need care, custody, or control coverage as well, because they're going to cover the pets that are in their care, custody, and control. And they also need that care, custody, or control to cover the contents of the client's home, which is another thing people don't consider. They think, well, this is a liability coverage, but most liability policies have an exclusion for personal property in your care, custody, or control. And so if you go into someone's house and they give you the keys for a week, you now have all of their personal property in your care, custody, or control. So if you damage a table or the pet gets out from maybe a puppy gets out from a crate, chews up all the mattresses or the, couches. I've seen it all. They chew everything. So that again,
I actually know a case of that where that happened.
Yeah.
Not in my care, but I have no.
Yeah, it happens. I mean, I've been doing this for a long time, and we see just about everything you can think of. And then, what you also consider when you have pet sitters and even trainers and boarding facilities is that not all claims. There's a lot of claims where pets may do something on their own. For example, they could jump off something and tear their ACL or be running. It's not necessarily the negligence on the trainer's behalf, but most of the clients, they want that pet in the same condition that they left it in. And so that's another coverage that comes, that we offer that's typically thrown in either under animal bay lead coverage or care, custody, or control. And you want to look at that, especially if you're in that business, because regardless of fault claims, you could be on a hike and get bit by a snake. It could be ingest something on a walk and have to have surgery, or be playing, if just playing outside and ingest something. And again, those aren't your fault, but they are legitimate claims, and that expenses do add up.
So let me ask you this, David, because I know, we pay insurance premiums, and sometimes we think we invest a lot of money in insurance, and then something happens and it doesn't seem that serious. So then the debate is, do I file a claim or not? Because the fear of our premiums going up. So what advice do you have to business owners on those kinds of situations?
Susan, that's a great question. I think the best advice I can give you is to look at insurance as for catastrophic loss. However, depending on your what you have and what you can afford, you have to take that in consideration. I mean, for some people that might, do $400,000 in sales, $1,000 may not be big to them. But if somebody makes $20,000 or $30,000 pet sitting and they've got a $2,500 vet bill, I would say turn that in. You have to look at each scenario. And again, you can always file a claim and then decide you're going to pay it. But it's best to turn the claim in just in case, because I have examples after example that where claims come back to bite you and they blow up. Where you thought there was a tiny little claim, and the next thing you know, this dog needs surgery, and it's going to be a $7,000 surgery. Yeah. Okay, and you decided you weren't going to turn it in. And so what some companies can do is they can say that you failed to turn it in a timely fashion, and then they can deny the claim. Most of the companies I work with typically wouldn't do that, but we need to know and turn the claims in efficiently and as soon as we know about them. So I know it's a kind of a if and when type of answer. I mean, but again, it really depends on what you can afford. But you always want to look at insurance catastrophic loss. You're not going to be canceled for one claim. There are some big insurers out there that may look at a frequency issue. So if you're having small claim after small claim after small claim, then you're going to need to suck some of that up. You can't just continue to turn in, because then the company's going to look and say you have frequency. But if you have one or two claims, they're not going to cancel your insurance for that, especially if you're doing a good job with safety and trying to do all the things to mitigate the risk.
Yeah, and I'll just jump into to basically promote good safety standards, because that obviously the more care and thought you put into for your facility, you put into training your staff and keeping the environment safe and doing all of those things. Susan and I actually recommend, in terms of dog bite injuries, if you're having more than 2 of those a year that require veterinary care, then that your insurance may or may not cover. So that's one thing. But the other issue that we would look at is there's a problem with how your business is operating. Generally it's either you're taking the wrong dogs or you're not training the staff properly. And so, if I would say if you're having claim after claim, you have to look at the bigger picture too, of what can you do to minimize the incidents. So I just can't let that go without doing that.
And Rob, if I can add on to that, I've seen facilities where the same person has claim after claim. And then it's well, maybe we need to, work with that person. If they're having, again, well, if it quacks like a duck, it kind of looks like a duck, we probably need to work on this, Yeah,
exactly. Well, what are you seeing with, Oh, go ahead, Susan.
I was gonna say, we having any questions, or just remind people to put questions in?
Yeah, I will go ahead and remind. I did post a comment out there, but yeah, if you have questions on insurance policies or concerns or anything that's come up, definitely post those in the questions, and we are going to monitor those, and we'll ask David any of those questions. I was going to jump to kind of what are you seeing now? The employment practices policy. When you said a lot of people have never heard of that, I was thinking, oh, I don't think I had that.
Yeah.
I don't think I've ever heard of that. So is that, obviously that's been around, but can you just kind of talk about that again? I can definitely see why that may be more of an issue now, but are you seeing a lot more of those claims now with today's environment?
We are, and unfortunately, these claims can get big in a hurry because attorneys, they charge large amounts of money, and really the defense cost alone can really kill you. And a lot of times for that reason, there's a lot of insurance companies will put like a $2,500 retention or deductible, so you're going to pay the first $2,500. And a lot of times we can throw employment practice liability insurance onto a business owner's policy. So if you're a boarding facility, daycare, you need to check if you don't have it. You can be added to your business owner's policies, and then it's not as expensive. It does cost, that you can get a sub limit of maybe $25,000, $50,000, or $100,000. If you have a whole lot of employees, then I recommend $1 million limit, just depending on because the more employees you have, the more exposure you have. Again, and this could be your employee hitting on somebody. It could be, like I said, let's say they didn't come in on time, and you retaliate and say you're fired, but they've been on time every single day before, and there may be something else, and that's called a retaliation claim. So I mean, as the owner or the partner in the business, you got to make sure that you're treating your people right and making sure that there are those things, and you also have good employment practices, meaning you got an employee handbook and all the good stuff that goes along with that. It explains how we treat people, and same with the other add-ons to employment practices is third-party coverage, which would say, let's say I were to come into your facility, Susan, and someone were to say a racist remark to me, or to say that you're Muslim or whatever, you can't come in. Okay, so that's the third-party claim. Now your employment practice is going to your clients, and so you could be sued for that too. So you also got to be looking at your employment practices policy and make sure you have that third-party coverage. This especially goes in if you're a dog walker, a pet sitter, or a trainer. I mean, if you're out there in the public, if you have employees that are out there in the public, and they say or do something, it could cause a lawsuit. I mean, because people are getting offensive right now. We're in a society that everything is I don't know what the correct word is, but it's all come to fruition. It's like with the Black Lives Matter, Me Too movements, everything that's coming in. That's why we're seeing more and more suits. Is people are very on high alert, and
Right.
People are looking to sue for just about anything. It's unfortunate. I think we should treat everybody equally, but it's unfortunate that that's what we're dealing with right now.
So
Go ahead, Susan.
okay. So if I realize I don't have that on my policy, and so I want to get it added, is it something that as soon as I pay and get the endorsement that it goes into effect, or is there a waiting period, or how does that work?
That was
If I need to add that?
exactly what I was going to ask. That's so freaky. That's exactly the
Yes.
question I was going to ask.
Yes, actually, I mean, you can get what's called prior acts coverage, but they'll backdate it. But typically, the insurance company doesn't want to backdate it unless you've had some coverage before. So, to start today, you could start today, and they would take events going forward, but it's not going to cover you for the prior acts. So, if somebody did something 6 months ago, because a lot of times these things will arise a year later. Somebody comes back and said, well, I was wrongfully terminated, or I was harassed, like what's happening at Fox News. They're coming out 6 months later and saying I was harassed while I was there. So those types of things can come out anytime. But yeah, I would say get it as soon as you can. And typically it can be added from going forward today. And, if your company won't add it, you can do a monoline policy. They get more expensive, and typically they will offer a lower sub limit. But, most companies will start with at least $250,000 limit. and it could run anywhere from $1,000 to $3,000 depending on how many employees you have. It could be even more depending on how many employees you have.
And does that, when someone files a claim under that employment practices kind of arena, does the insurance company come back and look at all those policies that you have in place at your facility? Like you were just talking about having an employment manual, having, training for sexual harassment or training for discrimination. Like, does the insurance company look at that in terms of defending you, or how does that come into play?
Yes, and what they would do is typically they'll allow you, most of the companies that I work with will allow you to actually, if you have an employment law attorney, such as a Jackson Lewis, which is I think all across the country, they're my employment practices attorneys. So, if something happens, they're going to know, they might have drawn up your handbook. So so they would be the ones that you might want working for you to defend you. And so you typically can pick your own attorney in most cases, as long as they're, a true employment law attorney. And, there's our attorneys out there that's generalists that may not specialize in employment law. And I always recommend that everybody at least have their handbook looked over by an employment law attorney, because laws vary per state, and you may not even be aware of some of the things. And I always also recommend looking at it maybe every 3 to 4 years and having them review it. It's just good practice because, again, things change, just like wage and hour laws. Things are changing throughout. It could be that now you have to have $15 minimum wage. I mean, so different things can pop up, and if you don't go back and review those things, it can come back to bite you. Especially if you have a claim and somebody says, "Well, they didn't fulfill, what the law says you're supposed to fulfill."
So, what other things are you seeing in terms of changes based on just today's environment? I know when COVID first started a couple months ago, we were getting a lot of questions, which we were sending to you, about whether or not pandemics are covered and business closures and payment for the owner who now doesn't have money. So have any of those things changed since we've started this pandemic?
No, and what I've been advising all of our clients is to, as soon as you have like a business income loss, you turn it in. The problem is most all business owners policies have, two parts that can negate coverage. One is there has to be a direct physical damage to your facility. There are some lawyers out there saying that, okay, COVID got into the facility, so that's a direct physical damage. But then they have to overcome the virus or communicable disease exclusions under the policy, which I don't see. That's going to be a much tougher thing to do, because this truly is a communicable disease and a virus that's going around. So I don't see how they can get around that. But attorneys are trying, and there's several lawsuits going on right now, especially with restaurants across this country. I haven't seen it much in the pet world yet, but it could certainly happen. And same with injuries to people. If I come to work and I catch it at work, a lot of people are questioning, well, is not covered under workers' comp because that's an occupational disease. Well, right now, unless you're like a frontline, rescue person or working at a hospital or working at an institution where you have to be around the disease 100% of the time, that's going to be probably covered under workers' comp. But if it's somebody who's a trainer or a boarding facility, it's going to be hard to prove that maybe you got that there, because how do we know for sure that it came from there? You may have gotten it somewhere else. If you're a dog walker or a dog trainer, you're going all over the place. That's very difficult to prove whether you got that on the job or not. And so I see the workers' comp companies denying the coverage, and the same with liability. Typically they have a communicable disease exclusion under there as well. So I don't see a lot of coverage, and I've actually seen a couple of companies that where there were regional insurance companies, not nationals, that write a lot of the boarding kennels and daycares and such, but some of the regional carriers I've seen adding exclusions for pandemic, to clean up their exclusions and make them even stronger than they were. So right. they were mild, but now they're all running scared, because basically the insurance companies would go under, and they understand that. So I think they're tightening it up. There are a couple specialty carriers out there that are now offering it, but there are excess and surplus lines companies, which the coverage is going to be very, very, very expensive and probably not worth it. I think I may have said this before, but I wouldn't be surprised if once we get through all this, that maybe there's something like terrorism insurance is for every workers' comp policy. You have to have terrorism, that they maybe put pandemic insurance. If you know, Congress and the Senate get together and they decide to work together and they come to a bill similar like they did after 9/11, they adopted terrorism insurance that people had to offer it. As me as an insurance professional, have to offer it under your professional and under your property and liability, and it's mandated under every workers' comp policy. I could see the same thing being born with this pandemic, that is offered and everybody has to pitch in. It's kind of like the National Flood Insurance Program. So everybody who lives in that flood zone, buys flood, is going through the government. And it's like a little bit of money that every insurance company's got to pay to build this up, so that next time this ever happens, if it ever happens, knock on wood, that there's coverage. Because right now there's not a lot of coverage and there's a lot of people upset about it.
Yeah. So we did have a couple of questions. Debbie had asked, why does it seem to be a problem with insurance companies if your home is on the same property as your facility in terms of getting coverage?
That's a really good question. And it's something that I get confronted with quite a bit, actually, because there's a lot of facilities and insurance companies want separation. And here's why. Because when you have your home, you have the personal exposure. You may have friends coming over. You may have, the postman delivering your mail, or Amazon coming and dropping off a package. You could certainly have that at your facility as well, but you have more of an exposure when you have dogs in that facility. If that dog can get next to your personal home. And insurance companies, typically you have personal insurance and commercial insurance. Personal insurance has exclusions for business, and business doesn't want to cover your personal, and they don't want to step into it. And so for that reason, most insurance companies want to see some separation. So if you have your driveway, I've told people, carve out a second road that comes to your facility. Just don't have it coming up to the same place, because if it's coming to the same place, they look at, okay, that's a combination of personal and commercial, and that's an overlap, and that's going to be higher exposure. It's just like if you're living there, and you're having your friends over, and again, a dog, they slip and fall, or a dog gets bit, that's more, if your own dog bites them, that's one thing, but now you've got this exposure where these people are coming into the facility that shouldn't be. Really, those are your friends, and they shouldn't be hanging out, in the facility and taking that risk.
But that's why we want to go to Debbie's.
Well, you can go to Debbie's, but just walk over here. You go over here, Robin, to Debbie's, and then you walk over here to the facility. So you just got to split it up a little bit.
That's funny. No, that makes sense, really. All right, and then we had another person that said, any suggestions for insurance companies for dog trainers that work with aggressive dogs? And you had mentioned this earlier. I think most do. I know when I had my facility, there were some insurance companies that wouldn't work with dogs that were, if I was working with dogs that were aggressive. So are there specific ones that to look for? Is that just a generic question you ask any kind of insurance company?
Well, we offer association policies through various associations, but we also have our own, which we can cover under Century Surety Insurance Company. We'll cover aggression. We'll cover all types of training except for police work or attack or fighting protection. And if you look at all the big companies, whether it be CNA or Hartford or Travelers, none of them are going to take on service dog training. They're not going to take on attack, fight. Everybody has the same exclusion for attack, fighting, and protection. There's really not any insurers out there. You're doing like police training. Really the only place to get that is typically through a municipality. So if you're on the police force, municipalities pay a whole lot more, so they're willing to take on some of that risk. But when you're looking for an individual trainer, there are companies that'll do aggression training. As long as you're, again, not training for police or protection. If you're training obedience, even if they're, insurance companies are aware that yes, some certain dogs can be aggressive, and they don't have exclusions for any type of breed. So I make sure we work with only companies that do not have breed exclusions. So, you can certainly do that. The thing is that you need to look at is the errors and omissions. And most companies that you buy a policy for, unless it's one of our association policies, it's not going to carry the errors and omissions coverage. That's going to be a separate policy. And you can buy that from Travelers or another company, but you got to be careful because a lot of people will buy a business owner's policy and coverage forms are funny. So in the large companies will do an errors and omissions form, but if you read the form, is not covering what we discussed earlier, which are the after the fact claims. True errors and omissions are, again, the after the fact claims. What they're covering under their coverage form is basically care, custody, or control coverage, or animal Bailey coverage, which it's just the way they type their form up and read. It'll say like boarding or daycare errors and omissions, but then you read it, they're not truly covering training, where there's an error or omission that comes after the fact, like I gave the example with the seeing eye dog, or a dog that jumps or attacks somebody, 2 weeks after your training is done, where you'll still be named, because every lawsuit, they name everybody. A lawyer gets a hold of it, they're going to say, oh, you had a dog that was being trained for aggression? But yeah, Susan was training my dog. They're going to say, okay, well, we're going to name Susan on this suit. We're going to name where did the thing happen? It happened at your house. So we're going to put it into your homeowner's carrier. And they're going to basically go after everybody. And then they're going to, try to resolve it. And you may be able to get a summary judgment and drop off of the suit, but you're still going to have to defend yourself. And that can be pricey, because these attorneys, are looking, whenever there's a dog bite, they're looking for big bucks and big settlements.
Yeah. So Andrea, who asked that question, followed it up with, she is working with rescues with aggression issues. So I'm assuming she's the trainer and she's working at a rescue group that's got aggressive dogs.
Yeah. So we can do that under our association policy. We work with trainers who go into rescues all the time. What we won't cover, or what I don't really have a single insurance company. I would typically refer them to somebody else, because there's a company that specializes in rescues and fosters, but they typically have so many claims. It's just most companies will not write that coverage. There's an agency, I think it's called WESOP or something like that. I'd have to look it up, but they specialize in rescues, humane societies, and things like that. But there are so many claims in there. But we'll cover the trainers if you're going in there and you're just training, because we know you're professional. We hope that you're a professional when you go in those facilities and you know what you're doing. So we're not worried about that exposure. What happens is you have people coming in there that may be volunteers and they get bitten, that may not have any experience. They're not trainers. And so that's why the rescues and those types of organizations are very difficult. Then the other thing that comes along with that is that no one owns the animal. So who's going to be held responsible? Yeah. Basically, yeah. So it's going to come back to you. And so that's what makes those very difficult to cover. But yes, we can answer to answer this question. We can cover you if you're training and you're going into a rescue to train a dog, or into a humane society or adoption area, whatever. It's fine.
Do you have anything else coming through, Robin?
Hang on. So Debbie said, am I correct in assuming that regardless of what you have a customer sign for release of liability as a trainer, it won't hold up if they were to sue?
No, there are different things. That's a great question, Debbie, by the way. So you can, that will help. So all those things help. That's why they ask and recommend that you have hold harmless agreements. They ask and recommend that you have procedures in place when you're letting people in and out of your facility, and you're not having 10 people take the tour in the back area. They ask that you do all those things because that helps them to protect you. It doesn't stop a lawsuit, but you might win. It's just, you have the right language in place and someone has signed off that they knew that they were coming into that dangerous situation. All those things line up to help you in the lawsuit, but they don't prevent the lawsuit.
That makes sense. I always say that it keeps the honest people honest. That's what I always say about those forms. But I always had them. But I think we often do hear that, oh, those forms won't hold up in court. But I would assume that it's better than nothing. It's just one more way to say you're trying to defend yourself or take the right measures to keep things safe.
It could be the difference between maybe a $250,000 settlement and maybe a $5,000 settlement, because they have contributory negligence if they have some of that stuff signed. So again, that's why they can come into play. But they can't. You're right. They definitely, attorneys can get through them, but it's going to vary depending on what they've signed. It's help. It's help when you have that lawsuit.
All right, that's all the questions for now. So if you guys have questions that are just listening, you can go ahead and just leave your questions in the comments, and we're trying to answer as many as possible. But I'll throw it back to Susan because I think you had another.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, David, because the other thing that we've seen kind of on top of the pandemic is a lot of protests. A lot have been peaceful, but some of them probably some not so good people are piggybacking on, and we've seen a lot of small businesses, broken into or have damage, or even worse, like that Wendy's that just got burnt down. So does your property insurance cover that, or do you need something else for like the rioting and looting situations?
No, that's a great question too. We're getting that quite a bit. I've had some people in Arizona who have been really, worried about it's gotten really dangerous where people are parked by their shop and they've had other people beside them where glass is broken and they have to board up their shop or board up their facility. And yes, your property insurance, that's what it's going to cover. It does, all of them are going to cover vandalism. But so vandalism, fire, all that's going to be covered under a property policy. And to take it one step further, if now they're shut down due to government authority, you can get that under business income coverage. Business income coverage includes government authority. So if they shut you down, say you were in Portland and you had your facility in one of those areas that's going on right now, and you're not, the government's not, you're not going to be able to get to your facility. And so basically that would be a business income loss. And so now you can't, your clients can't come because of the government mandate. So coverage would be there for that, because you did at that point, and unlike COVID, you had a direct physical damage to your facility. So you had a fire, you had a glass breakage. So that direct physical damage there, and then there's no virus exclusion for fires and looting. So I mean that, again, there you would have business income play out as well. Typically, you might have a 24-hour or 72-hour deductible for business income, but you need to make sure if you have a business owner's policy that on your property policy that you do have business income as well, because that is a vital coverage. If you have a hurricane or fire, vandalism, damage, and you're out of business for a week or 2 or 3 weeks, it's prime time. It's summertime. I know we're not traveling as much, but if, let's say it happens next summer when pent-up demand, it's the busiest time, you want to make sure that you don't have that business income loss.
That's great input.
Yeah, that's really good to know. We know quite a few people that have had issues like that. So, and I'm not sure at that point people are thinking, what do we do? They're just trying to board up their facilities and get away for a little bit so they can safely reopen. So that is good to know. Andrea said, what's the name of the insurance company that covers dog trainers? So David's from Business Insurers of the Carolinas, and I'm assuming that's who you were talking about, but is there another company that you wanted to talk about, David, or I thought that was
we have a direct relationship with Century Surety Insurance Company, which is out of Ohio. They're A- rated, and that's who's done our trainers for our associations. And we started working with associations back in 2001. And so if you're, and we work with CCPDT, we do APDT, IACP, PPG, just about every association out there. And I actually helped write the coverage forms, believe it or not. I worked with the attorney to make sure that, because I talked to the executive directors and got to know, what they wanted for their people. And they wanted to cover, not only, their liability, but they wanted certain types of training covered. They wanted their dogs covered if there was accidental injuries, because we see the torn ACLs quite a bit. I mean, that happens frequently with trainers. And, so things like that, we made sure that all those were included. Now, we also work with we're an independent insurance agency. So I work with CNA, Traveler, Hartford, all of those companies as well. It depends on each one. Each one of them has a different appetite. For the most part, most of those companies just want to see obedience training. They don't really want aggression, and they'll look at websites. Their underwriters will actually go to your website, and we'll see it all the time. People will come to us, and we'll place them with one of our association policies because they've been canceled by the Hartford because Hartford saw something on their website. So you got to be careful. You just make sure that whether you're working with us or not, it's no problem. If you're going with someone else, just make sure they know all the types of stuff you do, and have them look at your website and let them make sure that they tell the insurance company, because you don't want to find yourself canceled in 6 months. Because I see it happening more and more, because the web makes everything up front. So now everybody can see what you're doing. Especially you start advertising, you put everything on your website and everybody's watching. So even the people that you don't want them to watch, so.
Yeah, that's funny, because this was 17 years ago, but that actually did happen to me. I didn't get my policy canceled, but the insurance company called because I had a class called Rowdy Rovers on our website, and Rowdy Rovers for dogs that were reactive. And so they actually called to find out if that was like aggressive dog training or what that was. And anyway, But
Yeah.
and I know a lot more people are doing those kind of classes today. They did not cancel my insurance, but it was interesting because they just called because they saw it on the website. And
Yeah, and then we're seeing, like I said, we see that more and more. Where people, there's some insurance companies that might do trainers, but they don't want to do pet sitting, and so then somebody might have added pet sitting along with their training, and now they'll go on there. Hartford's a good example because they won't write pet sitters, so they'll do trainers, but then they see now that you're walking dogs or offering this other service, and then they'll cancel your policy, and people will typically call us at that point. But yeah, so again, it's just important that you talk to your agent, tell your agent all the services that you're offering and types of training that you're doing so that they understand. And hopefully they tell the underwriter, if they're a good agent, they should definitely tell the underwriter what you're doing and not put you with a company that's, going to cancel you or give you a hard time.
And then,
Well,
go ahead, Susan.
Well, I was just going to say, I would encourage, I think a lot of insurance companies really prefer everyone work through an agent and have that buffer. But I think there's great value in agent. And I know, David, you're not going to toot your own horn because that's just not the kind of person you are. But, then if you look at those coverage, my eyes would glaze over trying to read that stuff. And I think you kind of undersold the importance of being able to match, you understanding my business, and then you can match me to the right insurance carrier. And then, how often should we actually do a review and make sure things haven't changed? I think that's the value you bring to the table that is being under promoted here, which is not fair to you.
Yeah, and I would say too that my husband, who's actually really good at reading contracts and forms and stuff, but how often, David, does he just pick up the phone and call you guys because he's like, I cannot make head or tails of this? I think that's hugely important, and he's used to reading contracts. But if you're not in the insurance industry, just some things don't always make sense, and it's just really super helpful to get somebody who actually knows the business and can help and knows the insurance side of it that can explain things. We did have Felicia asking, do you cover this all states? Which I think most insurances do, but do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, well, not all agents cover all states. We do. I'm licensed in all 50 states, as is my agency. But most independent agents might only be licensed in their own state where they live. Because we've been working with the associations, we've been licensed in every state. Now, there are some issues in certain states where I run into, such as like Ohio and Wyoming and Washington and North Dakota. I can't write workers' comp in those states because they're monopolistic states, which require you to buy directly from your state. Then I have some issues writing property in Florida and Louisiana because the insurance companies will hold out capacity and only let their people who are right there on the ground, if they'll even write it at all. Florida's a really tough state from a property standpoint due to the hurricanes. Down in certain parts of Texas is very tough. You get around the Houston area. So I have some issues on some of those, but as far as liability, I can write in every state. And we can offer property in almost every state. We can offer workers' comp in almost every state. So, but yeah, but the insurance companies themselves, a lot of them are nationwide, like CNA. There's national insurance companies and there's regional insurance companies. Companies like Travelers, Hartford, CNA, Chubb Insurance, they're all national carriers. And so they'll write in all states. Maybe it's the exception of maybe Hawaii. They might not write in Hawaii. But, we do have offerings that we can cover you in Hawaii and Alaska as well.
Well, I guess insurance lessons learned being, you talk about hurricanes in Texas. Even Houston being 45 miles from the coast, I did have some concerns getting some renewal when we were going through some of that. But very early on, 6 months into my business being opened, we had a tropical storm come through, which dumped 30 inches of rain. And so my business had 18 inches of water in it and didn't even think about that area of Houston ever flooding before. But lesson learned, we then got flood insurance, which is something separate. And I'm going to admit things I didn't know about insurance when I got started was that needed to be separate. We were able to do the business interruption through our business policy, but yeah. I think flooding is changing. I've been in Houston a long time, and then when Harvey came through, areas that had never flooded are flooding. So I guess, how do you kind of work with people? How do they decide whether they need a flood insurance policy? What would be your advice on that?
Well, first thing you're going to look at is what if you're in a flood zone or not. And, there's different levels of flood zones, and so you could be in a 100-year storm or the 200-year storm. But like you just admitted, that it's happening more and more, and with, things that are happening right now, are unprecedented. We're seeing more hurricanes and more tropical storms, more just severe storms, and then flood is a separate policy, and it's tough now to find companies sometimes that'll cover business interruption under a flood policy. So sometimes even if you have flood, the business interruption might not cover.
Oh, okay.
And that goes back to the old dilemma: what came first, the wind or the water? So if the wind tears off your thing, and then it rains in there and it floods, well, that would be covered. But if it just floods and there's no wind damage, and you would have an exclusion, and there probably wouldn't be any coverage unless you have flood policy. And then again, a flood policy, you have to check with your flood insurer to see if they offer business interruption, because that's not always the easiest thing to get, especially places like Houston that have had a history of flooding recently. Same thing with North Carolina. If you go down to New Bern and some of the areas we've seen, and Lumberton, we've had some really bad floods because we're in that hurricane zone as well. Anything east of I-95 up in North Carolina is taking a risk, and you have a much better chance of getting hit with a flood. So it's tougher to insure in those areas. In Florida, especially because they get a hurricane almost every year, at least a threat of one.
Yeah, so I think, and Debbie said loss of business coverage for hurricanes has helped her several times. She's out in the Houston area too. So I think making sure that you're looking at what natural disasters might be most likely to hit your facility, and then what kind of insurance you can get, if you can get anything. Because I think that would go too to, like in some of my area in Colorado, wildfires are more prevalent. California, earthquakes, obviously. So is that just questions you would ask based on where you're living and what you can expect from that area?
Yes, and the other thing is that sometimes you might have to buy coverage for earthquake through like the California State Fund or somewhere else, because sometimes there's no one will cover you except either your state or the federal government. Again, the National Flood Insurance Program writes most of the flood insurance. There are some private flood insurers out there now, but probably good 80 to 90% are through the government. Even though you might have Travelers or a different company as your insurer, they're really placing it through the National Flood Insurance Program, which has limitations. So you may, like on a home, you may only get $250,000 in coverage. On a business, it might go up to $750,000. But if you have a $2 million building and it gets flooded, it could be, I'm no telling what the claim can be. So, then you have to buy excess flood. So all those things come in depending on where you are. And again, it also depends on what you want to pay. Because, if you feel like you're in an earthquake area, but you're not too concerned about it, and you've been through a couple earthquakes and they weren't so bad, you may be willing to, not pay that $10,000 premium every year. And as if you have an earthquake and it's not that big, and you have $30,000 in damage, after 3 years, you paid that. You pay in the $10,000 premium. So you have to kind of take that all into consideration. And again, like you said, it's a great point. Where you are matters.
Yeah. So I just have to say that Jen said, David, you're awesome. I need to email you again. Getting closer to opening.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
It's great.
Well, I think for all business owners, there is this cost versus benefit and how risk what you're willing to spend. And I think if you make some decisions to maybe go light on your insurance, I know for a while I didn't carry workers' comp because I didn't have to. You could self-insure. But the key is that you self-insure and set money aside. And then as I got more employees, I got workers' comp and was very glad because, a knee injury, a back injury, those things get expensive very fast. So I think, if you make decisions that, okay, I don't want to pay the premiums, but you need to set some money aside in case.
You're exactly right. Yeah. And, sometimes, again, that's where you'd already mentioned, like reviewing your policies annually, or at least every 2 years at the very limited least amount. But by doing that, you make sure that you carry deductibles. You have a money for a deductible payment if that happens, because you may not even be aware. Okay, you don't know your deductible. One thing, you should always know what your deductible is, But what things you take to self-insure, you need to be putting away over here, and having those discussions with your insurance agent is that, okay, I'm going to self-insure this. What's the recommendation for what I should be doing or how much I should be putting away? You have to take a careful look at it.
So we did have one question, well, two more questions. One is, can horse training insurances cover dog trainers?
That's tough. It's hard to find an insurance company that's going to do both, because people look at equine training differently. And so it's just because there's more incidents and there are different types of incidents with horses. So there may be an insurance company like Markel out there that does that. There's a couple of companies. I haven't specialized in horse training, but not many of the dog training policies will cover horse training.
Okay. And then last question, I'm going to say, Megan said, what do you search for to know you're getting a good agent? I'm just going to say you should just go to David.
Yeah, me too. I second that.
That's how I would say. But do you have specific things you would tell people to look for if they are looking for an agent, David?
Yes, I would make sure that the agent is going over the coverage forms as well. Talking about, if you're a facility, do you have animal bay lead? Do you have pet boarding, errors and omissions coverage under your business owner's policy? Are they thorough? Are they asking you questions and you're giving them all the information about your organization? And then if they don't have the time, I heard this the other day. I'm working with a startup that's actually out in Colorado, and she's doing a training and boarding facility. And she said she called an agent, and the agent, basically said, I don't have time right now, and didn't get back to her. Or the second time she called, she said they couldn't answer my questions. Well, if you have specific questions about the industry and you're asking about, okay, or how are the animals covered, and they can't give you an answer, or they say, I'll get back to you. If they don't get back to you in a reasonable time, those are the things that I would try to look at. And, it also helps to look for people who are specialized in industries. Just like I specialize in the pet care industry, there's people out there, there are other agencies that do the same. And then there's also people, in any industry, the people who specialize are going to be more familiar with the coverage forms than the people who aren't. And there are unique coverage forms, just as we already started with the basics. There's different coverage forms for trainers, there's different coverage forms for facilities, and your pet retail supplier. All those, there's different things you need to look at. And if somebody's doing it regularly and they're looking at those coverage forms, they can know that and give you that information right off the bat. If not, they may have to research it. And if they're doing, say I'm insuring a plumber today and doing a daycare tomorrow, and then I'm going to do a roofer the next day, and then a manufacturer the next day, they're looking at all different forms and they're having to go all over the place. And, things can get mixed up. They may not be on top of it. Whereas you're doing one thing all the time, and that's what I chose to do in my career, is because that way I know everything about that industry. And that's what I think you should look for.
So Debbie said, my takeaway from this is I need a new agent. She just emailed David.
Okay.
And I will say, and the reason that we love working with David is because he is extremely helpful and he's just a nice guy. But he actually knows his stuff as well in terms of insurance. But he goes to, when COVID is over and we're all traveling again and going to shows again, David goes to most of the pet facility dog trainer shows. He's usually at the pet boarding and daycare shows. So, if you are ever looking for questions, he's always willing to answer questions about your policy and that kind of thing. So definitely look him up for that reason too. Do you have any last comments, either David or Susan?
Well, I want to just put a plug in for my staff. I have a really good team too, so it's just not all about me. And the one thing that's different about our agency is that we have 6 people besides me that specialize in this industry. So, and 2 of them have 20 years experience. So that goes a long way too. So that's all they've done in their careers as well. So that's what helps, and I think makes us different from others. And thank y'all so much for today. I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah.
And I just want to say, don't feel like any question is a dumb question when it comes to your insurance or your policy, but find an agent like David that's willing to have patience and answer the dumb questions, because I do think it's an area that we know we have to have, and it can be overwhelming to get in and really understand the details of what we have. And we should, because it can make a big difference financially for your business. And so thank you for helping us make it easy for people.
Yeah, and I did put a couple links to Business Insurers of the Carolinas and also the phone number if you want to reach out to David anytime. And then I also just put a link in there for our Facebook group. It's Grow Your Pet Care Business that anyone can join and just talk about any questions you have. It's just a great community. Susan and I try to answer questions, but really the beauty of that community is there's hundreds of other business owners in there that are helping to give their input on stuff too. So it's really a great place. Our 2 rules are you have to be nice and you can't sell stuff. So either of those 2 things, I kick you out. But otherwise, it's a really fun community. So feel free to join that as well. And we appreciate all you guys taking your time to be here with us. And we look forward to seeing you on future Facebook Lives. And just thanks again so much, David, for joining us.
Thank you.